An admiral leads the best squadron in the world toward a harbor he believes is defenseless. He does not know that two ships built specifically to kill him are already waiting inside it. The morning of the 8th of December, 1914, South Atlantic, Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. Approaching from the south is the German East Asia Squadron under the flag of Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee. 5 weeks earlier, these same ships destroyed a British squadron off the coast of Chile in a single evening and sent 1,600 men to the bottom, saving not one. Von Spee's gunners were considered the best marksmen in the German Navy. His 2 armored cruisers had won the Kaiser's own gunnery prize. In those waters, nothing existed that could answer them. Von Spee is approaching the Falklands to burn the British coaling station and wireless post. He expects to find an undefended port. Instead, his scout spots something above the low coastline that should not be there. Tall tripod masts belonging to heavy warships and smoke far too thick for merchant vessels. Von Spee was certain the ocean still belonged to him. His calculation was wrong, and he would learn the cost of that mistake before the day was out. Riding at anchor in that harbor was something that had no place in his picture of the world. A ship fast enough to catch him and heavy enough to kill him, both from the same broadside. He had led the finest squadron in the world straight to it. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why Britain sent 2 enormous ships 8,000 miles for a fight everyone assumed was already decided. Why the very same German squadron that could not even be scratched 5 weeks earlier was swept from the sea in a single day. And why the German gunners in this battle fired with perfect skill, hit their target again and again, and it changed absolutely nothing. Before we go further, a quick question for you. Many of you had someone in the family who lived through a war at sea. A father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather who served in the Navy, the Merchant Marine, or coastal defense. Write in the comments who it was and where they served. These stories are worth preserving while they're still remembered. Now let's go back 5 weeks and 8,000 miles north to the evening this entire story answers for. To understand what happened at the Falklands, you first have to understand what happened at Coronel, because this whole voyage was payment for a single evening. On the 1st of November, 1914, off the coast of Chile, near the city of Coronel, Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock led 4 ships against the German East Asia Squadron. His 2 largest ships, Good Hope and Monmouth, were old armored cruisers, crewed mostly by reservists who had barely fired their guns in real combat. Facing him came Vice Admiral von Spee with the armored cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Those 2 German ships were the best gunners in the Kaiser's fleet, and they proved it. Von Spee held every card. He was in no hurry. He waited for the sun to set, and the dying light silhouetted the British ships sharply against the water, while his own hulls dissolved into the darkening Chilean coast behind him. His gunners could see their targets. Craddock's gunners could not see theirs at all. Around 7 that evening, at a range of 12,000 yards, the German guns opened fire. Scharnhorst's 3rd salvo crippled the flagship Good Hope. By 7:30, both British ships were burning, easy targets for German gunners in the dark. Monmouth fell silent. Good Hope kept firing almost until 8, then exploded and disappeared. Good Hope took Admiral Craddock down with her, along with 919 men, her entire crew to the last man. Monmouth took another 735, her entire crew as well. Not one man survived from either ship. Scharnhorst suffered not a single casualty. Gneisenau had 3 wounded. For the first time in over 100 years, a British squadron had been destroyed at sea. Craddock had almost no chance, and he knew it beforehand. His ships were slower than the German ones, his guns were outranged, and his crews were mostly reservists facing real fire for the first time. He'd been offered the option of waiting for reinforcement, an old, slow battleship trailing somewhere behind the squadron. But wait, and von Spee would simply vanish into the ocean, nearly impossible to find again. Craddock accepted a fight he was almost certain to lose, because letting the German squadron slip away struck him as a worse outcome than dying trying to stop it. He went down with his flagship and everyone aboard, and his choice directly set in motion everything that happened at the Falklands 5 weeks later. Britain could not let that account go unsettled. The shock in London was total, but the strangest thing was what was happening inside the winner's head. To understand that strangeness, you need to know where this squadron came from in the first place. Before the war, it was based at Qingdao, a German port on the Chinese coast, the pride of the Kaiser's Pacific Fleet. When war broke out, that entire ocean turned hostile overnight. British, Japanese, and Australian ships sealed the seas. There was no going back to Qingdao. The port was doomed and would soon fall. Von Spee led his squadron across the whole Pacific, island to island, scraping together coal wherever he could, shelling a French harbor at Tahiti along the way, and rounded Cape Horn into the South Atlantic. He was leading the finest squadron in the world across oceans where it no longer had a single home. Von Spee won at Coronel, and he knew it. But he knew something else, too. He had no way home. His squadron sat on the far side of the globe, cut off from any German port, surrounded by oceans the Royal Navy controlled. After the victory, he said so plainly. He was entirely homeless. He could not reach Germany. He had no secure harbor anywhere in the world. All that was left was to fight his way through the seas, doing whatever damage he could, until his ammunition ran out, or an enemy too strong for him finally caught him. There's one detail from that evening that says more about von Spee than any after-action report. At a reception held in his honor at the German club in the Chilean port, he was presented with a bouquet of flowers to mark the victory. He asked that the celebration stay restrained, and when he accepted the flowers, he said they would do nicely for his grave. Remember those words. A man who had just won the largest naval battle of his life already knew how it would end. He wasn't wrong about being doomed. He was only wrong about where and how soon it would catch up with him. Back in London, the answer fell to a man who had built that answer 8 years earlier. 2 days before news of Colonel reached the Admiralty, a 73-year-old man walked back in as First Sea Lord, John Fisher. He was the one who, years before, had created the newest and strangest warships in the Royal Navy. Now he needed something fast enough to catch von Spee and heavy enough to kill him. He knew exactly where to look, because he had designed the ship himself. Fisher's idea was close to Heresy. Take the enormous 12-inch guns of a battleship, put them in a hull long and narrow enough to run at cruiser speed, and strip away the battleship's heavy armor. The logic went like this. A ship this fast dictates the range of the fight, stands wherever it wants, and never has to sit under return fire. Speed itself was the armor. That was the entire bet. The world took a while to find a name for this ship. It settled on battlecruiser. And this ship had one purpose above every other: run down enemy cruisers on the trade routes and smash them from a distance the enemy could never close. Von Spee's squadron was exactly the prey this ship had been drawn to hunt. Here is where the arithmetic begins. Arithmetic we'll come back to all the way to the end, because the entire battle at the Falklands was decided by it before a single shot was fired. The British battlecruisers Invincible and Inflexible each carried 8 12-inch guns. A gun like that threw an 850-pound shell out to 25,000 yards, more than 12 miles. Von Spee's 8-inch guns threw a 238-pound shell and couldn't reach much past 17,800 yards. That's the whole arithmetic of what was coming. The British shell was nearly 4 times heavier and flew 7,000 yards farther. There existed a band of water, a wide band, where the British could hit hard and hit often, while von Spee couldn't even reach back. His gunners, the best in the German Navy, became useless the moment they entered that band, no matter how precisely they aimed. It's worth picturing what that meant in practice. One British salvo carried as much destruction to the target as 3 or 4 German ones, and it arrived from a range German guns simply couldn't answer. All the British ship had to do was step into its own lane and stay there, hold the enemy at arm's length, and hammer him while staying untouchable itself. Inside that lane, the German ship had nothing left to do but burn and wait its turn. But Fisher paid for that speed and that reach with armor. Invincible's belt was only 6 inches thick, thin for a ship that might one day face other capital ships. In 1914, nobody thought that would ever matter. We'll come back to that, and the cost of that assumption will turn out to be terrible, but much later. For now, remember only this. The entire invulnerability of the battlecruiser rested on distance. At long range, it was a god. At close range, it was a cardboard box wrapped around enormous guns. So began one of the strangest chases in the history of naval war. 2 British ships steaming south across the whole Atlantic, toward a point on the far side of the planet, where prey that had no idea the hunt had already begun was waiting. Vice Admiral Sturdee took the 2 battlecruisers south, and von Spee was rounding Cape Horn at the very same time, converging on the exact same point in the ocean. Neither force knew precisely where the other stood. The difference was that the British knew why they were going. Von Spee was heading for the Falklands after coal and easy prey, certain the port was undefended. The irony of that morning was almost unbearable. The ships sent to kill von Spee found themselves, at the worst possible moment, nearly helpless. On the morning of the 7th of December, Invincible and Inflexible entered Port Stanley and began coaling. Coaling a warship of that era was no simple refuel. It meant hours of filthy, back-breaking labor, the whole ship buried in coal dust, colliers lashed alongside, boilers banked low. A ship in the middle of coaling can neither weigh anchor nor build up speed. It needs hours just to raise steam. It was on that very morning, the 8th of December, that smoke from the German squadron appeared on the horizon. The fastest and most dangerous ships in the Royal Navy sat in harbor, half helpless, buried in coal, their boilers banked, while the enemy they'd come to destroy closed in. A few frantic hours at the furnaces stood between them and catastrophe. It's worth pausing here because von Spee had a chance that morning he never saw. Had he pushed straight into the harbor instead of turning away, he might have caught the battlecruisers at their single most helpless moment, riding at anchor, buried in coal, unable to get underway. One decisive strike in those first minutes could have flipped the entire day. The British heavy turrets still needed to come to readiness. The steam still needed to be raised, while German guns were already loaded. But von Spee saw the tripod masts, understood instantly what he was looking at, and his first move was to pull his squadron away, out to open sea. He chose flight. And flight from a faster ship was a losing bet from the moment he made it. The only chance he had that morning lay in an attack he never dared to make. The first German cruiser to approach Port Stanley was scouting the harbor ahead of the squadron's planned raid. Her lookouts expected an undefended coaling station. What they saw made no sense. Above the low coastline rose tall tripod masts, unmistakably heavy warships, and smoke far too thick for merchant vessels. Then the old battleship Canopus spoke up. She'd been grounded in the harbor as a fixed battery, and she fired blind, over the spit of land, without a direct line of sight. One of her shells landed close to the German cruisers, splinters catching the base of Gneisenau's funnel. Aboard Scharnhorst, von Spee understood in an instant what he was looking at. Battlecruisers. In the very last place on Earth he expected to meet them. He turned his squadron away from the harbor, swung southeast, and called for full speed. Behind him, chaos aboard the British ships hardened into order. Colliers were cast off. Stokers threw themselves at furnaces they had just banked. Slowly, then faster, Invincible and Inflexible gathered way and stood out of harbor into a flat, blazing, cloudless day. The sea was calm, visibility stretched for miles. For a hunter, it was perfect weather. And in weather like that, von Spee had nowhere to hide. What came next was exactly what von Spee had feared most, and exactly what he had no answer for. The chase settled into a long, silent overhaul. British smoke climbed higher. The range closed a few yards at a time, hour after hour, the gap between the fastest German ship and the slowest British one narrowing with the certainty of a sum being worked out on paper. The battlecruisers were faster. That meant von Spee could no longer break away, and could only choose where and when to accept a fight he had no hope of winning. For the crews on both sides, these were hours of a particular kind of tension. Aboard the German ships, stokers drove the engines to their limit, knowing that every extra turn of the screws might decide whether they lived to see sunset. Aboard the British ships, gunlayers waited as the rangefinder numbers slowly crept within reach, watching the distant smoke inch closer, hour by hour. For a long time, nobody fired. Two forces simply steamed south across a calm sea, while the arithmetic of speed quietly decided the fate of thousands of men on both ends of that distance. By 1 in the afternoon, the rearmost German ships came within range. Sturdee's flagship opened fire at long distance, the first 12-inch salvo throwing up towers of white water around the trailing cruiser. The range was enormous, past 15,000 yards, close to the limit of what any gun of that era could manage. This was exactly the fight the battlecruiser had been built to win. Stay far out, beyond the enemy's reach, and let the heavy shells do the work. Von Spee read that arithmetic as clearly as Sturdee did. His 3 light cruisers could not survive a fight like this, so he made the only choice a fighting admiral had left. He turned Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, his 2 large armored cruisers, directly toward the battlecruisers, and ordered his lighter ships to scatter and run for their lives. He would buy them time with his flagship, and with his own life. It was a death sentence, and he signed it without hesitation. There's a bitter kind of justice in the fact that the man who once spoke of flowers for his grave was now steaming toward that grave on his own order, buying a chance to escape for other men's sons aboard the light cruisers. 2 of his own sons were right there in that squadron, Otto aboard Nürnberg, Heinrich aboard Gneisenau. This is where the hunt turned dangerous, and where the moment arrives that makes this whole story worth telling. when the two flagships settled onto parallel courses and began hammering each other, the British ran into a problem entirely of their own making. Their own funnel smoke, thickened by the smoke of their own guns, drifted down the range on a light wind and hung there, a gray curtain between the gun layers and their target. Spotters aboard Invincible lost sight of Scharnhorst for minutes at a stretch. Salvo after salvo went wide into empty water. There was a cruel irony in it. The very battlecruiser whose greatest advantage was reach had just blinded itself at exactly that range. Smoke was interfering with British aim precisely where they were strongest. For several minutes, their enormous advantage in reach was worth nothing, because you cannot hit what you cannot see. Scharnhorst had no such trouble. Von Spee's gunners were everything their reputation promised. They found the British flagship's range and held it, and their shells began landing on and around her with terrifying accuracy. One after another, 8-inch shells struck the hull, tore through the upper works, slammed into the great ship's side. The finest marksmen in the German fleet were doing everything right. They hit and hit and hit again, and it changed nothing. The shells that found Invincible struck armor built to withstand far heavier blows, and burst against a hull that barely noticed them. A splinter here, a small fire beaten out there, a ragged hole punched through a funnel. Men felt the shocks through the soles of their boots and kept working the guns. Von Spee was fighting the one ship in the ocean he could not wound, at a range he hadn't chosen, and every perfect salvo he fired only measured what his perfection was worth. Here it is, the gap between two systems, compressed into a single physical object. A German shell weighing 238 pounds, striking exactly where it was aimed, and unable to penetrate. German gunners did precisely what earned them the title of best marksmen in the fleet, and scored hits that would have decided almost any other battle in the war. Here, those hits simply died against British steel. Little else in the entire war showed the gap between hitting and penetrating as plainly as this fight. One navy fired with more precision, the other fired heavier and farther, and weight and range beat precision outright. It wasn't skill that failed von Spee. What failed him was that British industry had built a hull that could hold the range and take the punishment at the same time. And German doctrine had never planned for a ship like that. You could have put the finest gunners on Earth behind those German guns, and they still wouldn't have reached. The problem was the shell itself, which simply could not arrive. Now the decision that would settle the battle fell to Sturdee. His spotters were half blind in the smoke, and closing the range would clear it, bring his gunnery under control, and finish von Spee quickly. But closing the range also meant handing the Kaiser's gunners the short distance where their weight of fire might finally reach something vital. He could end it fast and accept the risk, or draw it out and stay safe. He chose to hold the range long. He turned away, opened the distance, let the smoke clear astern, and accepted a slower kill in exchange for a certain one. It wasn't glorious. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was on his side. Aboard Scharnhorst, von Spee was reading the same numbers. Before this voyage ever began, he told a friend he was homeless, that the ocean was slowly closing in around him. Now it had closed. His flagship was burning in a dozen places. Her speed was falling away. The British had simply stepped back out of reach and kept firing. He knew there would be no escape, no rescue, no harbor to run for. He kept fighting because it was the only thing left for him to do. If this deep dive is worth your time, hit like and subscribe. Coming up, von Spee's last signal, sent to the man who once warned him to stay away from the Falklands entirely. The icy water where the fate of the survivors was decided, and a flaw hidden inside this very victory that would tear the British fleet apart a year and a half later. By 4 that afternoon, Scharnhorst was a wreck that was still firing. Flame ran her entire length. She listed heavily. Her funnels shot through, smoke and steam pouring off her, and still her turrets kept working, throwing shells that landed closer and closer to her own hull as the ship lost way. The vessel by now was less a fighting unit than a burning steel island, held afloat by momentum, snarling back with whatever turrets still functioned. Below decks, behind the armor, men worked on in smoke and flame, knowing there would be no rescue, because from miles around there was nothing but cold ocean and the enemy. Somewhere in those final minutes, von Spee sent a last signal to Nuremberg, to the very captain who had once warned him never to go near the Falklands at all. "You were right," he told him. Then his flagship's guns fell silent, one by one. At 17 minutes past 4, Scharnhorst rolled over. Her bow went under first. For a moment her stern hung in the air, screws still turning, battle flag still flying from the mast. Then the ship slid down into the South Atlantic and was gone. She took every soul aboard with her, more than 800 men, and Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee went down with his flagship. Not one man from Scharnhorst survived. The man who, 5 weeks earlier, had accepted a bouquet with words about his own grave, now lay at the bottom of that very grave, alongside 800 of his men. Invincible and inflexible, steamed slowly across the patch of sea where she had vanished. There was nothing to save. No boats, no rafts, no swimmers in the freezing water, only wreckage and spreading oil, and great white albatrosses wheeling low over the place where the flagship had been. The British ships didn't stop. Gneisenau was still fighting, and the day's work wasn't finished. Gneisenau held out nearly 2 more hours under fire from Invincible, Inflexible, and a cruiser that had come up to join them. Her guns were knocked out, one after another. She fired until she ran out of shells, and when the shells were gone, her own crew opened the sea valves. Around 6 that evening, the ship rolled over and went down, with her flag still flying. About 190 men were pulled from the water, blue with cold. Most of her crew were not, and aboard her died Heinrich, one of von Spee's 2 sons. The light cruisers, bought their head start by a father's life, ran, and the British cruisers ran them down. Kent chased Nuremberg so long that her stokers fed the furnaces with anything that would burn: wardroom furniture, ladders, the ship's own boats, wood shoveled in by hand until she squeezed out speed her builders never promised her, and finally caught her prey. Nuremberg sank. Aboard her died Otto, von Spee's 2nd son. Cornwall and Glasgow, meanwhile, ran down Leipzig. She fought to her last shell and went down late that night, taking almost her entire crew with her. Only a handful of her men were pulled from the freezing water. By nightfall, of the 5 warships in von Spee's squadron, only Dresden remained, the sole ship to slip away into the darkness. She was hunted for 3 more months through the far corners of the southern oceans before she was finally run to ground off a Chilean island, where her own crew scuttled her rather than let her fall into enemy hands. In a single day, a father and both his sons went down in the South Atlantic, each aboard his own ship. The East Asia Squadron, once the terror of the southern oceans, had ceased to exist entirely. Of von Spee's entire squadron, Only one ship survived that day. Everything else lay on the seabed. More than 1,800 German sailors were dead. British losses across the whole long battle came to 10 men killed. The exact same arithmetic as Coronel, turned completely inside out. 5 weeks earlier, a German squadron destroyed British ships in a single evening and lost almost no one. Now, British ships destroyed that same German squadron in a single day and lost 10. Same enemy, opposite outcome. Only one thing had changed: the tool Britain had sent to do the job. 5 weeks earlier, she'd sent old cruisers and half-trained crews against the finest marksmen afloat, and they were slaughtered. Now she sent the ships Fisher had drawn for exactly this work, and the very squadron that couldn't be touched off the coast of Chile was swept from the sea in a single day. The meaning of that day reached far beyond one battle. As long as von Spee's squadron was loose, no British merchant ship in the southern oceans was safe, and those same waters carried the routes that connected Britain to half the world. Destroying the squadron swept the last major German surface raiders from the oceans. The trade routes became safe again, and the cargo a Britain at war depended on moved through the South Atlantic without fear of heavy cruisers over the horizon. One squadron on the loose had been enough to keep an entire ocean on edge. One day was enough to lift that weight. The men pulled from the water rarely get told about. That's a shame, because that's where the human cost of the day actually lived. Gneisenau's senior officer was Hans Pockhammer. When his ship rolled over, he found himself in the freezing water of the South Atlantic, along with hundreds of his men. The British, who had just killed his ship, were now doing everything they could to save his crew. Inflexible and other ships pulled Germans from the water as fast as they could. The water of the South Atlantic in December drained a man's strength within minutes, and many who survived the battle itself never lived long enough to be hauled aboard. Pockhammer was pulled out alive. He became the senior surviving officer of von Spee's entire squadron. The British weren't risking themselves to save an enemy out of pure kindness. It was an unwritten rule of naval war still standing in 1914. A drowning enemy stopped being an enemy and became simply a man in freezing water who needed to be pulled out. What happened next says more about that war at sea than any casualty count. Admiral Sturdee sent Pockhammer, now rescued, a signal. The commander-in-chief was glad his life had been spared, and added that Gneisenau had fought most pluckily, and that both German ships had shown good gunnery. The winner, having just sunk an entire squadron, thought it worth telling the surviving enemy that he had fought well. Pockhammer survived the war. He went home and wrote a detailed account of that day, of his ship sinking, and of how he was treated by the British who captured him. It was this survivor who preserved the story of his dead comrades and his dead admiral, including one detail about the extraordinary calm weather that day. Its visibility, he wrote, surpassing anything in the experience of sailors. Perfect hunting weather, seen through the eyes of the prey. The victory was total, and yet inside it lay a flaw that would one day cost Britain dearly. The armor that had shrugged off von Spee's light shells was never meant to stop a battleship's shell. Against heavier rounds fired at closer range, that thin protection was a trap waiting for its moment. At the Falklands, Invincible was untouchable because the enemy couldn't reach her. But that invulnerability rested entirely on distance, not on armor. A year and a half later, at the Battle of Jutland, a German shell found the weakness von Spee's guns never could. On the 31st of May, 1916, Invincible faced German battleships and battlecruisers whose heavy shells her thin armor could no longer stop. These were not von Spee's old armored cruisers with their light 8-inch guns. One shell punched through a turret, and the flame went straight down into the magazine. Invincible broke in half in one enormous explosion and sank in 90 seconds. Of a crew of over 1,000, 6 survived. The very ship that had been untouchable at the Falklands because the enemy couldn't reach her, met an enemy at Jutland who could, and ceased to exist faster than Good Hope had taken to sink at Coronel. The idea that won so completely here carried the seed of that disaster from the day it was first drawn. Speed was armor exactly as long as the ship held the range. On the day it couldn't, 1,000 lives paid for it. At the Falklands, that same idea worked flawlessly, because von Spee had no way to force a close engagement. He had nothing to do it with. That's precisely why the same thin armor that killed Invincible at Jutland meant absolutely nothing at the Falklands. Let's go back one last time to that harbor on the morning of the 8th of December. 2 enormous ships sit in their own coal dust, boilers banked, half ready, while smoke from the most feared squadron on the oceans rises over the horizon. A few frantic hours at the furnaces separate them from disaster. By that same night, that very squadron lay on the floor of the South Atlantic, its admiral and both his sons dead, while 2 battlecruisers steamed home almost untouched. Ships that at dawn had been too slow to save even themselves had, by dusk, caught and destroyed an enemy that a proud British squadron 5 weeks earlier couldn't even scratch. More than a century later, in the spring of 2019, maritime archaeologist Menson Bound found Scharnhorst at the depth of 1,610 meters, roughly 113 miles southeast of the Falklands. The discovery was announced on the 5th of December 2019, 3 days before the 105th anniversary of the battle. There, in the darkness and cold of the South Atlantic, lies von Spee's flagship, and the Admiral's own grave, in the exact spot where his certainty ran out. The site was declared a war grave. Von Spee wasn't wrong about being doomed. He said so at Coronel, accepting flowers for a grave he hadn't yet found, 5 weeks before that grave found him. He was wrong about only one thing. He believed that in the South Atlantic there was still no ship that could catch him and kill him from the same broadside. For 5 weeks, that belief held true. On the 6th week, it led the finest squadron in the world straight to the 2 ships built to prove it wrong. And it wasn't marksmanship that beat him. His gunners were better than Britain's, and it didn't save him for a single minute. What killed him was a shell that flew farther than he could answer, and a hull that held the range while that shell did its work. Coronel was answered. The dead of Good Hope and Monmouth had their account settled, and the ocean belonged to Britain once more, right up until the day the same thin armor that had won this victory would take Invincible and 1,000 of her men in 90 seconds.